Alright, I made some more Pokemon fainting animations. If you weren't here for the first video in this series, this is what will happen. I animate original fainting animations for 3 separate Pokemon. What, you thought there would be something else to it? Nah, not really. Now this time I used your suggestions from comments in that video, and yes, there was more than one comment this time around. Now, I said suggestions, but only one person ended up commenting. However, I did step up my game this video with these fainting animations, so hopefully I can at least make some interesting ones this time around. Prelude aside, the first Pokemon suggested for this video was Basculegion. Now, Basculegion is a type of Pokemon I haven't animated before. What I mean by that is a fish type of Pokemon. I'm really stalling because I don't know what I want to do for this yet. I've never animated like an actual fish, but we'll see. Yes, I did animate Gyarados in my most recent idle animations video, but that was more of a serpent on land, not exactly a fish out of water in Basculegion's case here. Though some people would disagree on Gyarados being an actual serpent. Alright, aquatic animal debates aside, the point is that I was in unfamiliar territory when it came to Basculegion, as I not only had to figure out how to animate a fish in a creative way, but also conceptualize a fancy animation for it. So looking at how Basculegion usually looks in game, it is either swimming in the water in Pokemon Legends Arceus, or it's just swimming in midair. Despite these two completely contradicting states, I was able to come up with something that works for Basculegion. I decided to lean into Basculegion swimming in the air for this fancy animation. With this in mind, I started off by having Basculegion move towards the camera to get ready to pretty much fly into the air. However, instead of just simply flying, I wanted Basculegion to perform a circular loop into the air, but that's where I ran into my first problem. When I first tried to animate Basculegion swimming into a circle, it didn't really look right, as it felt like the pathing wasn't good, as Basculegion would keep going off track due to how I was initially trying to animate it. Then I had the idea of adding a circle to the scene, which I could use as a visual reference for the aerial swimming movement. That ended up helping out a lot, as the process for animating Basculegion was simplified by just following along the circle. Which leads me into the next part where Basculegion starts to descend towards the ground. This was actually pretty simple to do, as I not only keyframed the origin so that it would go down, but also animating its head, neck, and tail so that it would look upwards as if it lost consciousness while falling. I've also started to animate the camera when necessary instead of just always using a static camera angle, because Basculegion performing the loop didn't show up well with the neutral camera position. Pretty much like Pokemon Battle Revolution fancy animations. Yeah, I've come full circle at this point. Moving on from the camera, I originally went for a flapping motion with his tail that I repeated for a few times, but I did end up liking it. Also, when I first added that part, it made the animation longer, as with these 3 fancy animations in this video, I'm trying to make them way shorter than what they were in the previous video, where many of you mentioned that the fancy animations were too long. Turns out I only realized that after editing the video towards the end, so I made it a priority this time around to reduce the length of the fancy animations, which meant I had to take some creative liberties and not go all out and cut out unnecessary parts of the fancy animations. The tail flapping for Basculegion just happens to be one of the many cuts I had to make throughout this video. However, even with taking that out, I still needed a proper way to end the fancy animation for Basculegion. I then realized that Basculegion is not only part ghost type, but is also composed of numerous departed Basculins. That is where my idea to make Basculegion disappear by a ghostly flame took form. So I make this fiery effect to cause Basculegion to vanish with a magenta color to match some of Basculegion's color scheme. The only problem with this was that I had to do this for each individual part of Basculegion, so configuring that took a little bit of time. Nothing little copy and pasting couldn't fix though. Afterwards, I went back and animated some of the less pressing details I leave for last when I animate, and after rendering in some sound effects, here is the completed Basculegion fancy animation. Basculegion's simple fish design was something that was different from the other Pokemon I've animated in the past, but I felt the fancy animation for Basculegion was somewhat fluid. I especially liked the effect at the end, even though it took a little bit of time to get it set up. At least for this fancy animation, I personally don't think it is long in terms of time length, but I could still be wrong about that one. This does bring us to the end of the Basculegion fancy animation, and on to the next Pokemon for this video. The second suggestion I ended up going with was Mimikyu, which was actually a Pokemon I animated before in this Backrooms animation, so if you want to check out that animation, you could do so after this video. Or not. I can't tell you what to do. Anyways, already being familiar with Mimikyu is going to be a big help since I kind of know how to animate it on a surface level. That foreknowledge doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, as I still have to come up with the idea for the fancy animation. At first I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to go with. I knew I wanted to include Mimikyu's iconic animation of its disguise being busted after taking a hit from an attack. I had to add some originality to it, so I also wanted to incorporate the use of its hidden hands, as that is part of Mimikyu's actual body. Still, I had to keep in mind how long the fancy animation should be, so I couldn't go too crazy with this one. I settled on starting off with Mimikyu's hands coming out from underneath the cloth and grabbing the top of the Mimikyu cloth head. Yes, I know the cloth isn't its real body, it just wouldn't visually make sense to account for its actual body when making the animation. I also wanted to add a shaking motion for this part to show it's in distress, but as you can see, I couldn't get it to work at first. I'll come back to fix this part in a little bit. For now, I will explain the next part of the fancy animation that involves slowly lifting its head up and retracting its hands, which wasn't that complicated to accomplish. Then Mimikyu starts his back and forth motion of the top of the cloth, but I started messing around with it as it didn't look that impressive at first. That's when I added some poses of it leaning back and forth in between the left and right head swing, which gave me this spinning motion that made Mimikyu look more out of control, which worked out great for a fainting animation. This also happens to end the fainting animation as the momentum from the head swinging slows down and comes to a stop. Now remember this middle section of the animation I didn't finish yet? Let's go in and change that real quick. This process was actually pretty simple as I just added a noise modifier to the origin X and Y values, offset them a bit, and now we have a more haunted and twisted shaking animation. At least it's a lot better than what I had before. At this point, after animating a few details on Mimikyu, this is the full Mimikyu fainting animation. To be honest, I wish I was able to make this fainting animation longer to add a little more to it, but I think it's better to stick to the shortened versions as these are a bit more believable as fainting animations in reference to the game. Mimikyu actually wasn't too hard to animate overall, and it was more about figuring out the ideas for the fainting animation. Still, I do like how the animation looks as it's kinda simple but fun to watch. I think this is enough for the Mimikyu fainting animation, meaning we can get to the last Pokemon of the video. Our final suggestion for today was Malamar. Malamar is interesting as it has a few things going on, like its paper-like edges on the arms and legs, also the hair, which will end up being its own procedure in itself down the line. Getting started with the Malamar animation, I started off with its arms as I wanted to begin the animation with it filling its arms in some way. This took some time as the arms required a decent amount of work in order to get them to do what I wanted. After delaying each individual keyframe, the result looks pretty good, showing off Malamar's elasticity. Look, I'm not entirely sure how to describe its arms either, but the point is that it works. Continuing from making Malamar resemble a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man, I had it lower its head and start bobbing back and forth to then have Malamar fall over. Now I'm not gonna lie, getting Malamar to fall over wasn't easy as I had to keep trying different things until it worked. I won't bore you all by explaining it in full as it wasn't anything special, really just trial and error, but I got it to fall over and not look completely unbelievable. Since I was actually making this animation live, someone in my chat actually gave me a great idea to make Malamar look like it was going to take a bow, then fall over, and I actually liked that idea. Adding the bow was simple as it was just animating Malamar's arms to mimic a person bowing, but obviously a squid kraken thing doing it instead. I even animated the spine to rotate during the arm flailing part so that it looks like it's panicking after taking a fatal attack. Even after doing all of this, I'm sure you all noticed that I haven't animated the hair yet, so let's change that. For each part of Malamar's hair, it contained 4 to 5 bones for each one, meaning I had to animate each and every part of Malamar's hair so that I could get the movement I wanted. I first referenced how Malamar's hair looks from a neutral position, but at this point there are actually 2 paths to take on animating Malamar's hair. I could either make a consistent hair animation that will loop throughout the entire fainting animation without much variation to it, or I could animate almost each and every hair frame according to how Malamar moves during the entire fainting animation. You wouldn't believe which one I chose. Yeah, I animated it the second way. Trust me, it was as much work as it sounds. However, doing it this way produced a more dynamic effect as opposed to looping a singular hair animation. I'm glad I did it this way because the hair feels almost more alive than Malamar itself. Almost. Of course, even with this fainting animation, I added a few small changes, fixed the rendering issue, and here is my version of a Malamar fainting animation. Within this fainting animation, I'm glad I was able to include a lot of animation involving its arms. Even though Malamar is kind of a stationary Pokemon with these 90-degree right angle triangle paper legs, I felt pretty good about the fainting animation since the part where Malamar falls forward onto the ground actually works logically with the design in mind. Making these fainting animations have created an unintentional challenge of a time, or should I say frame limit, as my previous fainting animations were all around 500 frames each. This time they were at most 250 frames, about half the time for these fainting animations, which the time constraint technically could limit creativity as I have less room to implement a lot of things into the full animation, but I don't think it's a bad thing to keep that time limit in mind. As always, please leave your suggestions down below for which Pokemon you want to see me try to make a fainting animation for. Also, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss when I drop a new video. Links to the Twitch channel and the Discord server will be in the description down below. I think that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time.